Today, I'm taking a look at someone so controversial that she's been called a charlatan and a monster, a messiah leading a cult, a genocidaire who should be in prison for crimes against humanity, and
one time, somebody disagreed so strongly with what I wrote that they flew a plane over my office to explain their disagreements on a banner.
Which all seems a little bit over the top to me. I think there are some fair criticisms to be made of her work, but on the whole, I think she's someone who cares about empowering people with good information and being driven by data, not politics. That's probably why she's simultaneously accused of being a closeted right-winger funded by right-wing billionaires and a lefty jab addict. But hey, maybe you'll disagree so strongly with me on this that you'll fly a plane over my house. Let's find out. Welcome to the Internet Reviewed, where I'm taking a critical look at the online world, one content creator at a time, to help you know who's worth following and when to smash that mute button.
Shut up! Shut up! Shut up!
Today, it's someone in the parenting space, Emily Oster.
Hi, I'm Emily. I'm the founder and CEO of Parent Data, an economics professor at Brown University, the author of Expecting Better and Crib Sheet, and a mom of 2 great kids.
Now, if you have children, you'll know there is no shortage of people online, or offline for that matter, offering you advice on how to raise them. These people pop up all over your social media feed, telling you what to think about vaccines and breastfeeding and sleep training.
It's a great way to give a child a foundation of mental illness. Okay, so don't sleep train your child under the age of 1.
Or about gentle parenting and big feelings and allergies.
And if you're keeping your baby emotionally healthy around food, probably food allergies are not going to be a problem.
Who knew anaphylaxis was caused by being too sad around peanuts when you were a baby? Anyway, Emily Oster is one of the faces your algorithm might serve up.
There are a lot of worries as parents. Here's one you don't need to worry about. Kids drinking bathwater.
She's got 500,000 followers on Instagram, about 250,000 subscribers to her website and newsletter Parent Data. She's done podcasts, she's written a bunch of best-selling books, and she pops up on mainstream media from time to time too.
Emily, good morning. It's so good to see you.
Emily, thank you for your service and good morning.
But she's a bit different to most of the other gurus in this space. She's not a doctor or a child psychologist or a nanny or an earth mother or a certified parent coach, which is apparently a thing. Instead, she has a PhD in economics from Harvard. In fact, she calls herself a vagina economist.
I'm like more of a vagina economist. Okay, so I'm going to end the day by telling you my best vagina economist story.
So her expertise is really in numbers, looking at what the evidence says about statistics and probabilities and risk.
I write about pregnancy and parenting from the perspective of data, trying to help people understand what the data really says about so many of the big questions we have in those areas.
I find this a really refreshing way to look at things in a space that's really dominated by anecdotes. You know, this worked for me, or this is my personal pet theory, or this is how we did it back in the day. She digs deep into the studies that look into these questions to tell you what they tell us, and sometimes what they can't tell us, about what you should do, eat, drink, take, wear.
My goal is to empower you with that data to make the decisions that work for your family. Parent Data is not about telling you what to do. It's about giving you evidence-based information to make your own best decisions.
One of her key messages is that you should weigh that data up along with your own personal preferences and values.
When we look for data and evidence about our choices, it's going to be an answer to, what's the risk, what's the benefit. And it's very, very rare that there would be a choice where it was like all of the evidence suggests that you do one thing, like it's a terrible decision to do the other thing. I mean, there's occasional things like that, but it's very, very rare that that would come up. So when you get the information, what you have is this is the risk, this is the benefit. And then you've got some preferences or values or other constraints, logistics, whatever, that have to lie on top of the data.
A lot of the controversy around her is because her read of the data occasionally differs from the received wisdom or public health messaging around, say, what foods you can eat while you're pregnant.
This is my first claim to fame. I'm the person who showed you the data that said it's okay to eat sushi from a good restaurant on your birthday or also other days.
Or whether the benefits of breastfeeding are overblown.
When we dive into the best data, we do see some small positive effects of breastfeeding. a reduction in gastrointestinal illness in the first year, a reduction in eczema, maybe some impact on ear infections. But many of these claims that are made about IQ or height or health as an adult, those are really not supported in the best data we have.
Probably most controversially, she says that there's no good evidence that drinking small amounts of alcohol while you're pregnant is dangerous.
Excessive consumption of alcohol is very dangerous during pregnancy. Having said that, when we dial into looking at evidence on occasional drinking, no more than one drink at a time, particularly in later trimesters, we don't see any evidence that infants born to mothers who drink at that level have any different performance on behavior or cognition.
I know that's a very hot take. It's one we'll take a closer look at in a moment, along with some of her COVID commentary, which upset people all across the political spectrum.
People have yelled at me quite a lot more than even usual, and so that's been hard.
But first, let's just take a look at what it is she's offering online.
One of the things that seems to be true of modern parenting is people view every moment of your parenting as an opportunity to ruin your child forever. Like, if you rush them out the door in the morning, that could be it. That could be the decision that ruins them for their whole lives, which of course is not true, but it like imbues every interaction with this kind of like intense sense that it's the be all and end all.
I agree entirely with that observation, and I think what she's offering is pretty much an antidote to that.
You should stop worrying and not follow these people on TikTok anymore.
The first thing I'm going to point you to is her most recent podcast series called Raising Parents.
The very idea of parenting is only a half a century old. Before the 1970s, the goal of parenting, which wasn't even a word, really was just keep as many kids alive as possible.
It took a really thorough look at what the evidence tells us around questions like, are we over-parenting or over-medicating our kids? Have we forgotten how to discipline? And are smartphones stealing childhood?
We need information and data. We need to hear from experts who've thought carefully about these questions. And we need this information so we can separate hype from truth and make our own best decisions.
At her Instagram account, she's got a whole lot of easily digestible, reliable information, including short-form videos giving you the lowdown on various topics.
We're headed into a 3-day weekend, which means a lot of you guys are going to be potty training. I have 3 pieces of advice. One of the only consistent pieces of advice I give about birth is that you should get a doula. Let's talk about the importance of sleep.
And a weekly Q&A section answering questions sent in by her followers, which often reveal just how much people are overthinking this stuff these days. Questions like, will wearing socks ruin my baby's feet?
No, socks are fine. They keep your baby's feet warm.
And is there anything wrong with eating boogers other than it's gross?
The issue is really with the acquisition of the boogers rather than the eating of them. If the boogers were sort of like surgically removed, it would be okay, but it's the getting of them that's the problem.
I'd particularly like to recommend the collection of stories you'll see at the top of her account called Data Greater Than Panic, which is all about explaining the actual data behind so many of the unjustified, panic-inducing headlines you see in the media.
Recently, a study was released that claimed to show a link between having been born by planned C-section and developing childhood cancer. I want to talk about why the study's bad and why I think it's bad when research like this is amplified in the media.
And that's all kind of a gateway to the much more detailed content available at her website and newsletter, Parent Data, which she launched in 2020. Here's her pitch for that.
Parent Data is a data-driven guide to pregnancy, parenting, and beyond. We cover life stages from trying to conceive, pregnancy, early parenting, parenting slightly older kids, and we have content on perimenopause and menopause. And it's all written with a focus on evidence, data, and decision-making.
The site now has a number of contributors and co-authors, including pediatricians, child psychologists, fertility specialists, endocrinologists, doulas and midwives, OBGYNs, speech pathologists and social workers, a puberty expert, and even an AI-powered personal librarian called Petey.
And you can also find Petey, our chatbot, who can give you a quick answer in the middle of the night so you can go back to sleep and not panic Google.
Okay, so that's what Emily Oster is offering. But why do I think she's worth listening to at all? You know, why not just stick with the public health advice? Well, It's because I appreciate her explaining with detail and nuance what the evidence actually shows. Because anyone who's been pregnant or is raising children will have had the experience of receiving confusing and conflicting advice and wondering what it's based on. Let's take the drinking alcohol while pregnant example I mentioned earlier, because this one understandably gets so much of the attention. Emily Oster's own doctor had told her that it was probably okay to have a glass of wine. Lots of women have had this experience.
When you look at surveys, something like 40% of obstetricians will say, well, some amount of alcohol is okay. And clearly a lot of women, like myself included, are getting that advice, like, yeah, a couple drinks a week is okay, like don't overdo it.
Now, the thing about this question is that you can't really design an experiment to perfectly test it. But as Emily explains, there are other ways to go about trying to find the answer.
You want to look at women who kind of say never have more than one drink at a time and, never have a binge drinking episode. And I looked at that. I tried to find data like that, and there actually are like a number of large studies. They mostly come from Europe or Australia, where drinking at this level in this sort of moderate way is just more common in pregnancy. When you look at those, the evidence shows that the children of women who drink in moderation perform as well, sometimes better, on IQ tests, in measures of behavior problems, as children, as compared to children whose mothers abstained. So taking from that evidence, I think what one would conclude is that there isn't any good evidence that drinking in moderation like that causes problems.
Now, as I said earlier, this remains one of her most controversial claims, and you should know that it has received some strong pushback from organizations like the American Academy of Pediatricians and the National Organization for Fetal Alcohol Syndrome. And pretty much all public health organizations still say there is no proven safe level of alcohol while pregnant and that women should abstain entirely. I will link to some of their statements in the blurb so that you can check them out. Still, the fact remains that there are plenty of doctors and medical experts who share Emily Oster's read of the evidence. So are they all wrong too? What's going on here? What are we supposed to make of all of this? Here is how Emily Oster explains the discrepancy. This isn't her voice, but it is quoting her writing.
So why are official recommendations about alcohol consumption during pregnancy so cautious? One is overinterpretation of flawed studies. But the bigger thing, I think, is the concern expressed to me over and over again by doctors that if you tell people they can have a glass of wine, they'll have 3 or 1 gigantic glass. Even if 1 isn't a problem, 3 are. Better to say you can't have any, as that rule is easy to understand. I can see the argument here, but to put it mildly, I'm not crazy about the implication that pregnant women are incapable of deciding for themselves. I strongly believe it's important to arm women with the data so they can have the opportunity to form their own decisions.
And I think this is basically the crux of a lot of the criticisms around her. Her approach is helping individuals weigh up risks and benefits to make decisions for themselves, whereas public health authorities are trying to get through to large groups of people with a simple and clear and cautious message. I think both are valid approaches, and I think this Reddit commenter made a really good observation about it.
I feel what she needs the right audience. From people with high anxiety who are worried their pasta a la vodka is going to give their kid fetal alcohol syndrome, she's good. Those people thinking fetal alcohol syndrome happens to other people, she's bad.
The other element to this is that different academic fields interpret data differently. Emily Oster talks a lot about how she thinks some study designs are much better than others.
The sort of biggest split I would have here is between studies that are randomized and studies that are not.
And she clearly places a lot less weight on studies that show correlation rather than causation. She talks a lot about this.
What we very commonly see are studies which just compare people who do one thing to people who do another. Mm-hmm. And in many cases, those people are very, very different in other ways, some of which you can observe and some of which you cannot observe.
But some public health experts say she's getting it all wrong because she doesn't follow the same protocols they do.
That's the really scary part of having a person like Oster, who is not an epidemiologist, distilling this information to the lay public. it's basically as bad as the anti-vaxxers.
I have to say, I find it a little bit weird to say that Emily Oster is as bad as the anti-vaxxers when her position on vaccines is totally consistent with public health messaging. She says the evidence shows they are safe and effective and you should probably get them. And she explains in a lot of detail why she thinks so. But, make of that what you will. And if you want to know more about how Emily Oster approaches the data, she's published a piece on her Parent Data website explaining her process.
There is increasing value to transparency about what's the process by which one is coming to conclusions. And what's hard is that if you're using 2 decades of being a professor and another, 7 years or whatever of like high level training to figure these things out. And so it's not like I could just be like, oh, I look at the study and I look at these 3 things. Sometimes the answer is like, I look and then I can tell there's something a little weird. And then I look in the appendix table and I know which appendix table I want to be looking at. And I want to that's too much to explain. And so how do you give people enough transparency to understand and trust that you're sort of showing your work without literally being like, here are all the 4 billion things that I did, and in this particular case, which is boring and overkill.
So I like her transparency, but I trust her for a few other reasons as well. Now, firstly, I really like that she's prepared to admit when she's wrong or to revisit something when new information comes to light. And there's a famous example of her doing this from early in her career. So in 2005, she published a paper where she'd analysed existing data and made the argument that skewed sex ratios at birth in Asia, which meant many more boys were being born than girls, could be partly explained by hepatitis B infections.
And as you might expect, that claim was very controversial. It also, ex post, turned out to be wrong. So about maybe a year after I had done this, some guys came along in Taiwan and actually had much better data.
So she took that data and then she went to China to collect more data.
And it turned out actually, no, there was no link between either maternal or paternal hepatitis and the gender of the kids.
So she published a new paper rebutting her original thesis.
And basically said, look, this earlier argument was based on this effectively circumstantial evidence. We have better evidence now, and it just doesn't seem to be what's going on.
Now, she got a lot of kudos for this because, frankly, it's quite rare for people to publicly own up to their mistakes like that.
This puts you in a very small class of academics who have the privilege of conceding that you were wrong, and even better, publishing a paper showing it. I mean, that's really, it stuns me, really. I'm not being facetious at all. How rare it is in our profession that someone, when a paper comes out that counters what the original paper found, someone then concedes that they were actually wrong.
I'm going to link to that interview in the blurb so that you can listen to it in full. It's a really interesting conversation. And I think it makes clear that she's someone who cares about getting things right, not just about winning an argument. And I think that's a very rare and valuable character trait these days.
And it feels really bad to mess up. And I think that was definitely something that I learned.
Okay, let's get into the COVID stuff now because it's the root of a lot of the criticism and anger and baggage that comes with any discussion of Emily Oster. Emily became a COVID commentator kind of by accident. She'd launched her Parent Data newsletter in February of 2020.
Almost immediately was the case that every question I got was about COVID and, particularly about COVID in kids and COVID in pregnancy because that's the audience that I was writing for. And so I ended up, just because that was what people were interested in, writing a lot about that, learning a lot about that, eventually doing a bunch of data collection around schools, doing some advocacy around schools. And so it just sort of turned into a whole thing.
And at a time when everything had become super polarized and you had some people sort of insisting that experts were infallible gods and then others who had totally lost faith in expert advice entirely, Emily's newsletters really stood out because they took a more humble and, I guess, transparent approach to communicating all the uncertainties involved.
During the pandemic, a lot of what I did in my writing was like, here is what we think we know now. I'm going to come back and tell you, I'm going to send you another newsletter next week in which we're going to update and we'll learn more. And I think that approach developed a lot of trust in some of the other public health messaging did not deliver that type of trust.
Her approach did generate a lot of trust. In fact, her newsletters were so significant as a source of information for parents during the pandemic that there has even been an academic article written about them.
Calm in the Storm, Emily Oster's parenting newsletter during COVID-19.
As that article describes, the newsletters focused more on advising her readers on how to think rather than what to do, and talked to people about how to make decisions based on their own personal circumstances. The paper did also note that her approach is clearly most useful for families who have the luxury of options, which I do think is a fair criticism and something to always keep in mind. So her newsletters were one thing, but Emily Oster was also publishing opinion pieces in the mainstream media, which managed to put everybody offside at different times. So she annoyed mask-loving people on the left with pieces calling for a more sensible approach to mask rules.
The idea that somehow there would be a political feeling about wearing a mask.
Yeah,
right? It seems
extraordinary.
Insane.
There was this piece titled "Your Unvaccinated Kid is Like a Vaccinated Grandma," in which Oster suggested that families should feel okay about having holidays together even though kids couldn't yet be vaccinated.
And, the headline wasn't very good. The headline was a little more aggressive than I would have said. But I think people just got very angry and sort of with the idea that, you're being dismissive and, you're going to encourage people to, do unsafe things and be anti-vaxxers or whatever.
Probably worth noting here that writers often aren't responsible for these sorts of provocative headlines.
You wrote a little thing in the newsletter about it where you said sort of I would have used a different analogy possibly. Do you still feel that way?
Yeah, I still feel that I think the piece would have been more impactful if it had been clearer what I meant. Basically, what I was saying was that in terms of serious illness, these risks are comparable.
And some people got particularly mad about her calls for schools to reopen.
I spent a lot of time advocating for school reopening in particular. That was the thing that I got most into. And in those conversations, a lot of what was driving, some of what was driving my views was that actually did not look like, it did not look like schools were important sources of COVID infection. But some of what was driving my view on this was it seemed to me like there were very extensive costs of school closures and that the downsides to closure were real and should be weighed against any, public health benefit to keeping schools closed. And when we were having these conversations in the public health space, that part, that there's a cost to this, often didn't come up. It didn't come up in school closures, it didn't come up in many other things. It was sort of our only goal is to lower the number of infections. And if even one person might get COVID at schools, we should close schools. And of course, if that is your standard, you should close schools because you cannot guarantee that kind of safety, even with all of the mitigations one could have. It's just that's impossible and crazy. But it also didn't seem to me like that was at all the appropriate trade-off, given that there were these costs. And I think that when we look back on it, there are a lot of examples of that where we just didn't think about the cost-benefit calculation. Instead, we just thought about what is the choice we make that will most aggressively limit the spread of the pandemic. Sometimes we got that wrong too.
My take is that I think reasonable people could reach different conclusions about how to balance the risks in COVID. But I do think it's a bit silly to accuse her of being a monster or a genocidaire or a teacher killer for the positions she took.
Part of what made these conversations so challenging is that people were talking about their preferences without talking about the fact that what they were saying was that they were weighing these trade-offs differently. And instead of saying, I see this trade-off this way, you see it this way, it was, you want to kill people. Well, actually both sides, you want to kill people. And so I think that made the conversations difficult to have in any objective way. And I understand it was an extremely fraught time. I'm not criticizing people's desire to have angry conversations, but I think it got in the way of thinking about this carefully.
And while it was largely the left that she'd pissed off with her early opinion pieces, it was the right that really reacted badly to a piece she wrote in October 2022 titled "Let's Declare a Pandemic Amnesty." This is the article that prompted someone to fly a plane over her office. The banner actually read, "No Amnesty, Oster." Now, in the piece, she was basically calling for people to forgive each other for all of the, things that had happened during COVID and to focus instead on working together to solve the problems that we now face. And a lot of people let her know that they were simply not ready to do that.
One of the things that a lot of people wrote back to me was, and I didn't read most of these because they contain death threats, but when I did read the parts that were not like that, one of the things that really came out was sort of the feeling of I lost my job because of this vaccine mandate. And the motivation for that was that, I was going to be a risk to spread to other people, but actually it turned out like I am no more a risk to other people than somebody who is vaccinated. And so that is unfair.
So look, I know this remains a polarizing subject for many people, but I just wanted to give you that overview of the COVID time because it explains a lot of the strong feeling that people still have about her today. And finally, just to deal with a claim I see made online quite a bit about her that she's secretly funded by far-right billionaires and so she is downplaying risk to further a narrative. Let's unpack this one. As best I can tell, this claim stems from the fact that during COVID, she set up a COVID data hub to collect data from schools. Now, that database project was funded by Mark Zuckerberg and Priscilla Chan's foundation, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, and Emergent Ventures, a program at George Mason University supported by Peter Thiel, among others. Now, I do think it's very relevant to know who funds research, but I don't think Emily Oster was trying to hide this at all. The funding for the project is disclosed on its website. I also don't think it means that the research is not being done honestly. Now, there have been some reasonable criticisms of the quality of the data that the project has collected, but it seems to me that it is a good faith effort to at least get some data where there was not much to go off. I'm going to use this Reddit user's contribution to this discussion because they've pretty much summed up how I feel about it.
A smear by association. The fact that some of her conclusions appeal to right-wingers and they therefore wanted to support it doesn't mean that them doing so was her motivation or that her conclusions were unsound or her research biased.
The other reason I'm very skeptical that she's being paid by right-wingers to do their bidding is that when you look at her broad body of work, there really doesn't seem to be a political agenda to it at all. In fact, some of the things she's said you could call out as being more sort of liberal or progressive positions, I really do think she actually just follows the data wherever it leads. Now, I know I've defended Emily Oster a lot in this video, but that's because so many of the criticisms of her I found to be either bad faith misrepresentations of what she's actually said or just to be too silly to engage with. But I will point you to a critical piece that I read and thought was reasonable and worth thinking about. Now, it does come from a leftist magazine, so know that it's coming from a very political perspective, but basically it takes issue with the whole economic style of reasoning, which emphasizes individualism, market-based choice, and efficiency while deprioritizing concerns related to injustice or collective well-being. I'm not saying I agree with everything in that piece, but it did give me some food for thought. Now, it wouldn't be a video without Kenny interrupting me at some point, and here he is right at the end. So yeah, look, my overall position is obviously that I think Emily Oster is an excellent person to follow, especially in the parenting and pregnancy space, where it can be very difficult to navigate all the spurious information you're often hit with.
The things that are important are quite a bit more fundamental than people are understanding, like your kid having enough to eat, and having a stable place to sleep and having people who love them and maybe occasionally hearing words and being read to. Like those are kind of the core things, and people get very occupied with things that are much, much smaller and almost certainly do not matter.
As always, let me know what you think in the comments, or you can email me at theinternetreviewed@gmail.com. And I'm always happy to take suggestions on people you'd like to see me review next. Thanks for watching.